Morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for our webinar on encrypted traffic management in conjunction with Symantec. My name is Craig Charles. I'm the sales manager at OpenReality. Just going to cover a couple of slides positioning the agenda and a little bit of background on OpenReality for some of you guys that don't know us. So I'm just going to move these slides along. So yeah, just agenda today, you've probably seen on your email invitation, we're going to be focusing on the sort of growth of SSL traffic and the kind of emergence of threats using sort of SSL, and yeah, and then just kind of linking together what solutions we've got to help IT departments kind of combat those threats or sort of assisting your existing technologies with SSL traffic. We'll probably do a bit of Q&A at the end, so all the lines are on mute at the moment. If you've got any questions, please use the chat box, and we'll come to them at the end as a bit of a Q&A with James at the end. Yeah, just like a one-slide OpenReality. So both Blue Coat and OpenReality, and myself, sorry, are celebrating a bit of a 10-year anniversary. So yeah, I was been here kind of originally some of these 10 years were the sort of Packeteer products that we sold. We were probably the biggest Packeteer partner about 10 years ago, and Blue Coat acquired them, I think it was 2008, and we've had a very successful partnership with Blue Coat for the remaining 8 years, and I've certainly seen over the last 10 years the sort of the changes in the product lines and how the acquisition has been positive in a lot of ways, and the product portfolio has grown, and we certainly expect to see that moving forward as well with Symantec acquiring Blue Coat, and yeah, the product lines being kind of integrated and improved. Like I said, our background was Packeteer, and certainly we probably got the reputation as the kind of the best network performance and optimization Blue Coat partner in the UK, but certainly security has been a big focus of ours over the last few years, in line with our customers who are seeing, obviously security being a high priority. So yeah, we've got a good experience of both product sets. I mean, this is just some customers that we've got. These are some of our bigger Blue Coat customers. It's kind of a broader list than this, to be honest, but these are some case studies we've got with a mix of network performance products and security. If there's any questions about OpenReality or some of our customers or products, then feel free to contact us. If you've got your relevant account manager's details, please do. If not, feel free to send an email in and we'll get back to you. But that's really my piece. So I was going to pass you on to James, who's the ATP sales specialist at Blue Coat, who's going to be covering the remaining of the slides, and yeah, we'll be doing the Q&A at the end. So thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you, Craig.
Sorry, James, I'm just going to pass you the controls.
That's great. Thank you.
Right, you should have that now, James. Is that working?
Let me give it a go. Okay, I think that's good. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. So, as Craig was saying, my name is James Stevenson. I oversee Blue Coat's encrypted traffic management business for the UK, Israel, and South Africa. We've been doing that for about 3 years now. And obviously, with the acquisition by Symantec, it's very much business as usual. And I think what's interesting today is I'm only going to take 30 minutes of your time today. And I think during this discussion, and especially the Q&A at the end, I suppose there's 3 questions I would like you to reflect on during this engagement. Number one is really, do you have an idea of how much traffic on your network is encrypted today? Is it 30%? Is it 70%? It's a really good question to find out if you're not sure. Whether you're a security guy or part of the network team, for example, it's really good to understand that percentage, because that represents the blind spot, which obviously has an element of risk to that blind spot, so you can mitigate it. The second question for today to consider is, what are you currently doing about it? There are various ways you can inspect SSL traffic. You can do it on a next generation firewall. You could do it on an application delivery controller like F5 or an A10 of this world, or you can have a dedicated SSL solution like we have. But there are pros and cons to those various strategies. And no doubt the organizations that you're representing today are probably doing maybe one or two of these various options. So we'll go over those I suppose, the pros and cons of those options. And also finally, when you know what the percentage of traffic is and you think you're doing some level of SSL inspection, after today you should have a really good idea to say, can I improve on that strategy? Can I be more comprehensive? Let's see if we can go to the next slide. Okay, so I think this is a pretty obvious statement, but it's a good primer for the next part, and that is obviously that encrypted traffic management is growing. I think on average it's about 50% of network traffic is encrypted with SSL TLS traffic, and on average it's growing 20% annually. But again, I've been involved in various projects for small, medium and large enterprise for the past 3 years, and I'd say it varies. Some organisations it's 30%. If I work with financial institutions and government, for example, it's very common to see over 70% of their traffic is encrypted. That's a significant blind spot which they can't see into. And I think what's interesting here is even if you look at, it's pretty obvious why we're all adopting cloud-based applications. Like I myself, just started using Office 365. Blue Coat had just moved over to Office 365. Things like Gmail and Salesforce, for example. So obviously everyone's starting to use the cloud over HTTPS, and obviously that's driving that type of traffic. And I think what's also interesting in terms of behavior is something actually I wasn't aware of until recently, is that even Google are now starting to prioritize websites. So when you're Googling for certain websites, if your site offers a secure connection over HTTPS, then typically you will actually be graded higher. So they're kind of pushing to the end users more secure sites as well. So, and obviously from an end user perspective, we want to, when we go to banking, for example, or our Facebook or Hotmail or Gmail, of course you want it to be encrypted to protect your data. Now, interestingly, as we start adopting SSL communication, unfortunately, that's also the same case for the attackers out there. And what I wanted to do is just give you a bit of context on this next slide. Is our research team worked with VirusTotal recently. It's obviously an entity that has the antivirus capability from many vendors, such as Symantec or Sophos, Kaspersky, etc. There's over 30 to 40 different antivirus vendors that work together in the cloud to, as you know, it's an arms race, to kind of sample unknown malware and build signatures very quickly and push that out to the user base to obviously detect those threats. So we obviously have API access to VirusTotal's service, which is collaborative in nature with the antivirus community. And we basically queried that and said, let's look at the known malware family, such as Dridex or Gozi, Timber. I'm sure there'll be some here listed on the left that you'll be familiar with. And let's see, this is all about known threats, not unknown threats. So this is just everyday pain that we will experience in our security operations today. And we said, of those known ones, which ones are now starting to leverage SSL TLS, encrypted communication for the use of downloading malware to bypass security controls. And this is really what's driven the campaign in conjunction with us and obviously Open Reality, because we just wanted to show, I suppose, increase the awareness of this trend. So if you just see on the, if I click next, there's a little bit of lag on my presentation, so please bear with me for a second. Okay, guys, I'm trying to move to the next slide. It's struggle. There we go. So as you can see here, from October of last year, what you can see here with this orange bar is the amount of known malware that's using SSL to communicate. And what's interesting here is from around October of last year, you can see there's a sudden spike to around 120,000 known malware variants now leveraging SSL encryption. And that's obviously a very worrying trend because that risk exposure has increased dramatically over a very short period of time. And actually, I asked the research team only a couple of weeks ago to extrapolate that further to give us, I suppose, a sense a whole year of trend since this trend was spotted. And you can see that it's been relatively consistent. So there's a massive spike here, and this is why it's now essentially become a board-level concern, which I'll talk about in just a moment. And one of the key things that has driven this is I don't know if anyone on the call is familiar with the Let's Encrypt initiative. It was released last year, and as you know, if you want to set up a website and offer an encrypted opportunity for end clients to talk to you, you have to have a certificate with a public and private key that has to be signed and trusted by the community. And that is actually typically, there is a cost to having that trusted signed certificate. Well, Let's Encrypt was driven by, everyone should be able to have the ability to have a trusted and signed certificate. So it's like free certificates for everyone. What that means for the attacker is they can now set up a website, send loads of spear phishing emails, get your free iPad here, click that link, and go to a website over a secure connection, and it didn't cost them anything to set up that website with that secure, trusted certificate. So it's just basically made it cheaper and accessible for attackers to very quickly set up drive-by exploit servers. And when you go to that website, it's going to be trusted. You're not going to get that alert that says, this is not trusted, this is self-signed, run away now. I'm sure people on the call today have seen that on their browser of choice. And you're not going to get that now because attackers now can essentially get trusted and signed certificates. And this is why I think I don't think it's a coincidence that when that initiative was launched last year, suddenly attackers started leveraging that free service. But also they know that a lot of organizations, 60% of organizations don't inspect their SSL traffic. So if they send some known malware, your network security tool of choice is going to drop that. But if you are not doing SSL inspection, they encrypt it on the hopes you're not inspecting it, and then it bypasses your investments. And interestingly, just to show where we are, by next year, 50% of all malware will leverage SSL, and not just advanced sponsored espionage, all the funky stuff that marketing teams like to focus on. Just your everyday known malware variants are now starting to leverage that. The same is for the command and control servers. So the previous slide I focused on the, first stage of infection, the malware being delivered as a result of that spear phishing email, that link you're clicking on, for example, or maybe it is actually an attachment over that email, such as SMTP or POP3 or IMAPS, for example. And once that system gets compromised, that system will typically beacon out to a command and control server, or a C2 server for short, and say, look, I've been infected. Do you want me to download some more malware, such as keyloggers? Do you want me to, laterally move in the network? Do you want me to exfiltrate data I found on the system, maybe through keylogging tools? And that data is now also being exfiltrated over SSL TLS. So again, we talked to VirusTotal about the command and control component of an infection in various stages of that. And again, you can see over the past 2 years, there has been a 200-fold increase on the malware communicating essentially to its, I guess, its mothership, really. It's probably a bad analogy, but essentially communicating out and exfiltrating data over SSL TLS, because again, they know you're typically not inspecting it. So in summary, whether it's malware being downloaded or data being exfiltrated out, it's a very worrying trend that many organizations are now aware of and are now doing something about it. Okay, now just to confirm that. If we look at the CyberEdge 2016 report recently released, this is a report that essentially interviews many C-level execs and what they consider important. And what's very interesting here is, in terms of board level concern, obviously malware and phishing, denial of service, advanced persistent threats are in the top 5. But what you'll notice here, that to validate what we've just discussed as a primer, is that SSL encrypted threats is now a top 3 concern for organizations. And if you just look closer to the statistics on the right here that's highlighted, 3 years ago, encrypted threats wasn't even on the radar. And this is actually a score out of 5 based on the questionnaire to these various entities. And you'll see that now, it's basically, ranked number 3. So it just really validates that it's a really big concern for businesses across all verticals. Okay, so now we're aware of that kind of threat landscape. Now, what's the problem? And essentially, it's driven by, if you think of any investments you have today, or maybe any active projects you're working on now, a data loss prevention project, intrusion detection system, or IPS. Maybe you're investing in sandboxing to reduce time to detection of unknown malware that's bypassing your antivirus signatures. Maybe you're investing in a full packet capture solution for that kind of enabling a strong post-breach posture by rewinding the tape. The problem with these technologies is they can't look into the SSL traffic. So there's many projects I'm involved in where a bank, for example, or a government entity might be saying, we're buying a sandbox. sandbox. I say, that's great. Why do you buy a sandbox? Well, to detect advanced threats. Oh, okay, but half the advanced threats go over SSL, so how are you going to look into that? And they typically haven't thought about that. So they're buying something that's only 50% effective. Again, depends on the amount of traffic on the network that's encrypted. And that's a real challenge. So we want to talk about how we can feed those devices to make them better. And again, as I mentioned, you can do it on a UTM firewall or an IPS. The problem with that is performance. If you think of a next generation firewall that's doing, whether it's VPN, IDS capability, antivirus, it's also acting like a proxy, for example. It's doing a lot of stuff that's computationally expensive. To then ask it, oh, by the way, you now need to do SSL inspection. There's a recent NSS Labs report. Again, we can provide all the links to the white papers after today. But essentially, there was an 80% performance drop on that appliance in terms of throughput capability when you turn on SSL inspection. So most customers that have tried that ultimately then turn it off because they have to end up buying more firewalls, for example, to load balance that additional concern, really. And also, I'll go into a bit more detail a bit later, there's also, devil's in the detail. Everyone says they can do SSL decryption, but when you look at the amount of ciphers they can support, for example, you realize that they are not all created equally. And just briefly on this, for those that have maybe not seen Gartner's adaptive security architecture on the right, essentially what it's saying is we've all heavily invested in prevention-based tools, and we still need that for good defense in depth. But most customers are now rebalancing budgets, focusing on rapid detection tools at the bottom right of the quadrant, which is sandboxing, but also realizing that there's always going to be some kind of incident despite investments. So we need a strong instant response capability post-breach, and that's where maybe full packet capture comes into play. And what the Gartner is saying is that you must address the SSL component as well. So really SSL is the foundation to all of those projects, whether it's an existing IDS project or maybe a refresh or a sandboxing or forensics project, that you could argue that they are at risk of failing unless you solve that SSL visibility piece to get true visibility. So in summary, when I engage with various customers, I suppose across multiple verticals, essentially we speak to those program managers, security architects, network architects. They have a good broad view of all the projects that are happening in the organization. And the moment we identify any projects that you can see listed here, we obviously ask them, what is your blind spot and what are you doing about it? And that's typically how the engagement starts. And what's interesting here as well, again, another recent stat I've added recently is really from the Pomon study, or the Institute, really, Pomon Institute, and saying that 40% of the victims said that SSL was used, at some point of that attack, whether that's the download of malware or the exfiltration of data. So just think, if you've got any projects like listed there, go away and find out what are we doing about that network blind spot. Again, I won't go into these into detail. I'm sure Open Reality will provide a copy of this presentation afterwards, so you don't need to write any of this down. But there's obviously a lot of sources, whether it's US Securosis, Fraunhofer, for example. I think there's 451 Research Labs. There's many white papers available to you today that says you've got to have a good encrypted traffic management strategy. And so I won't read all these out. There you go. There's Gartner, 451, NSS Labs, for example. So I think this is the key one here, actually, from 451. It's a huge blind spot for enterprise. And it's interesting as well, because you also have to balance, the need to look into that traffic, but also respect employee privacy. And we'll talk about that later about policy-based decryption. You need the ability to say that if I'm going to maybe a banking and healthcare site, don't touch it. But if I have a user going to a confirmed command and control server or a drive-by exploit server or a site that violates my policy, to closely replicate maybe your proxy policy and enforcement, we now want to inspect that because it's a violation of policy or is deemed a high risk based on the URL of the host that they're speaking to. Okay, so if you look at with that primer, let's look at the various, I suppose, architectures that are available to you today to try and resolve this risk or mitigate this risk as much as possible. You could, of course, try and do SSL inspection on the firewall or the proxies. Take a Blue Coat proxy, for example. You're more than welcome to turn on SSL inspection on our Blue Coat proxy and get visibility. But there is a self-serving aspect to it. It pretty much decrypts for its own need. It doesn't decrypt once and feed many. So it's a bit of a kind of a selfish way of doing it. So what you have is you'll have multiple security devices duplicating effort which obviously causes latency on the network, and it's not a good way of doing it. We mentioned the performance issue when you turn it on. That also includes Blue Coat proxies as well, but Palo Alto or checkpoint firewalls, Cisco devices, they all have a challenge when you ask it to do SSL inspection. And also, again, as I said, devil is in the detail. Most of these typically will support around 10 cipher suites. Whether that's public keys such as RSA or maybe Diffie-Hellman, maybe symmetric keys like Camellia or AES. They only support, and obviously there's the hashing algorithm that's combined with that, whether that's MD5, SHA-1, etc. And they can only support around 10 of those. When actually there are over 70 plus combinations of cipher suites available out there. So though they can do SSL inspection, they're very, very limited. It's not a comprehensive way, and they can't look into quite a lot of that SSL traffic. So again, you still really have that blind spot. And secondly, or thirdly really, most of these technologies, including Blue Coat's proxy as well, they very much focus on web traffic only, HTTPS, and that must be over port 443. Well, attackers aren't going to play by those rules. They could run HTTPS, SSL, TLS over any port. I suppose, I used to be a security analyst, but there are 65,000 ports I think that's possible. You can run SSL on any of those. So the problem with these technologies is they're typically they're not port agnostic. So you need something that doesn't care what port it is. I want to find SSL. And the same applies to the protocols. Again, they just focus on HTTPS. But as I said, there are, you could have email protocols like SMTPS or POP3S or IMAPS. What are you doing about those mail-based protocols that are using SSL? And then think from a file transfer perspective, FTP, right? That could be FTPS, SSL, FTP over SSL. So you need to have this isn't going to solve those multiple port issues, multiple protocols. There's a performance issue, and it's self-serving. So, it's better than nothing, but there are real challenges when it comes to implementation and, I suppose, having a comprehensive monitoring strategy. I think a more common approach I see, especially in the finance sector, is leveraging existing investments like an A10 or an F5, application delivery controllers. And they are obviously excellent tools for their key purpose. And they obviously do a level of SSL inspection by doing something they call it SSL Termination, rather than kind of man in the middle. And there are challenges with this, and a lot of companies that I speak with, they will try this first, and when they realize the operational complexity of it, then they will have a conversation with us once they see the reality of it. I mean, first of all, it requires a lot of complex scripting. So when you're putting in if you look on the left here, the SSL offload part on both sides, think of these as maybe two physical appliances, for example, from F5 that will do SSL termination. You've then got a period on the network, which is a compliance issue for finance organizations, where there's a live part of your network where sensitive data is currently being decrypted, so to allow your security tools to investigate that data, and then they will re-encrypt and forward as valid. The problem is with this approach is, again, it requires a lot of network configuration, in terms of routing, IP changes, iRules. There's a lot of complexity to put that in. It's very disruptive, and typically head of networks get very nervous when they see the changes they have to do to make this work. And that's a very common occurrence. Also, we talk about compliance. Any of these tools could do man in the middle. They could do payload modification. They could modify the data that was, after all, it was encrypted to be protected. It could potentially be modified, and there's no, essentially, there's no hashing check. So when it's re-encrypted, that protected data during the decryption process could have been modified, and that's a massive compliance fail as well, especially in the finance and healthcare sectors as well. So this is the challenge they have when they try and do SSL inspection with an existing investment like an application delivery controller. But it's something to be aware of. It's certainly something worth trying. Again, in my experience, a lot of organizations do. But be aware of those challenges, and that there's always a better way of doing it. In terms of cipher suites, I talked about how UTM firewalls might be able to support circa 10. A10 and F5 actually a lot better. It could be around 40 out of the 70 plus cipher suites. So it's certainly more comprehensive, but it's only just over half really. So it's not the best as it could be. And I mentioned the data integrity issue. Now, what we want to talk about today is the way OpenReality and Blue Coat Symantec are doing it today. Which, well, first of all, it's not a side. It's an appliance. It's not a side feature of another product. Oh, let's just add on SSL inspection. It lives and breathes SSL. That's all it does. It's the only value it provides. It's a layer 2 network tap that will decrypt once and feed all your existing investments that you can see here. So even from like a high-level design, reference architecture, I'm sure most people on the call agree, it just seems much more logical and palatable to do it this way. And the key thing as well is because it's a layer 2 device, it's working at the MAC layer, you don't need any routing or IP or configuration changes before or after like you do with the F5 approach, for example. So you literally put this in as a bump in the wire, it's completely transparent, so you don't need to do any network changes. And this is why a lot of our organizations that we work with are really happy with it, because you can deploy this very, very quickly. Typically within minutes, if all the prereqs of change control are there, but it's not disruptive, so there's low operational risk. And we can ensure data integrity. I talked about before how during the SSL termination with an application delivery controller, you can change the payloads. Well, when we decrypt and feed the passive devices and the active inline devices like an IPS or a DLP, when it's finished with its inspection, it will either accept it, deny it, block it, etc. We actually send the original data that we received before we decrypted. So we can guarantee that the payloads haven't been changed during the inspection process. And again, this is a really key point to prove data integrity. And also, like I said, it doesn't care what port, it will just look at the SSL handshake and decrypt. And we can do known server key decryption, so inbound SSL inspection, but also certificate re-sign. So when maybe your users are going to web servers they don't control, so we can inspect that traffic. Just go to the next slide. Okay, so what I wanted to show with this slide is it's very much a vendor-neutral approach as well. If you remember, I talked about before that it's very self-serving typically, where you decrypt and feed yourself. The reason why we've had so much success with this particular solution is that it works with any vendor, including competitors as well. You can see the likes of Cisco, Checkpoint, for example, RSA. Obviously Blue Coat and Symantec have a very large portfolio for to solve many solutions, or many problems, sorry. But just to give you an example of various anti-malware, data loss prevention, next generation firewalls, this will decrypt and feed all of these investments. So it's very, very, there's low complexity of deployment, because it's layer 2. It can feed multiple security devices, active and passive, and we can prove data integrity. And also, going back to that performance issue, you're not going to kill your proxy or your firewall or your IPS trying to do SSL inspection. You're essentially saying, offload that SSL responsibility, so there's a dedicated appliance. It's got I won't go into details today, but it's a custom chip actually, which has been built specifically for SSL decryption, which means you don't get the performance hit either, so it's much more cost effective. Okay. I kind of mentioned the maintaining data integrity, so I'll skip this slide today and you can look at this at a later time at your own convenience. But this is about the ability to confirm we haven't modified any data after decryption. I kind of mentioned this as well in terms of, there's two ways of doing this. Again, if you want to monitor, so I'm thinking of a particular bank in the UK that wants to monitor SSL for performance reasons. They have lots of users coming inbound to applications and servers that they control. And of course, that means they have the private keys. So they can inject the private keys into the solution, or we can integrate with an HSM, for example, like SafeNet Luna SP1, and that will allow us to inspect that traffic. And that obviously allows them to still do all their performance monitoring tools to make sure their customers are getting a satisfactory experience. It's now, because so much of their traffic is encrypted, they could no longer check the performance of their applications at the network level. So this particular bank that's deploying it at the moment, that's enabled them to see again, essentially, and leverage those network performance monitoring tools that were they were essentially losing the value in that investment, but as the blind spot increased. And the other more common approach of using this is, again, when all your users internally are going to servers you don't control, so you don't have the private keys, and that's when you must do essentially a certificate re-sign, which is what we can do as well. Now, when we work on projects like this with many customers, at some point, you start to engage with the likes of HR, works councils, compliance teams, legal. And I think my point, the reason I wanted to say this is, a few years ago, I think everyone knew the value of looking at SSL traffic, but those initiatives were blocked because it was kind of a decrypt everything or decrypt nothing, and it was causing real issues from a legal compliance, privacy perspective. So Blue Coat's obviously renowned as a proxy vendor where they categorize sites. Banking, that's a healthcare site, that's an adult site, for example. And we leverage that dynamic cloud intelligence. So as we're inspecting, when you configure our appliance, it's very hard to see, so you might have to squint on this, my apologies. You can see here with this policy, we just said, look, if you're going to known malicious sources or malnets, your user's going to a phishing site or a malicious outbound drop zone, for example, then inspect. So it's very easy to enable policy-based decryption. And the reason I mention that is because if I think of a very large pharmaceutical I've recently been engaged with, who lost some cancer data research, the initiative was blocked 3/4 of the way in because legal stepped in and compliance. They got very nervous. So we quickly demonstrated, well, actually, we can do this policy-based decryption to get a balance. I think this slide, in fact, I think someone changed that for me, thank you. But that actually gives you a really good example of the ability to say never decrypt banking, government, healthcare, but do decrypt traffic that's violating the policies that we define, or maybe that might be compliance violations, or when you're going to known malicious sites. And it will allow you to get that balance between, you have an obligation to protect intellectual property, customer data. I know everyone's probably starting to talk about GDPR, and I think it's really important to ensure you're compliant with that HIPAA or SOX, for example, as well. So I think my key point here is that the granular policy-based decryption has really allowed many of our customers to come back to the table and say, right, now you can do this. I can now solve that objection from legal and compliance and HR. And just as an example, with that pharmaceutical company, we spent about 2 hours with them talking about how it works, demonstrating it in the console, and then they signed it off. And then the security and network team that invested in data loss prevention, forensics, I think they had FireEye for sandboxing, for example, they can now see into that SSL traffic. Okay, I won't go into too much detail on this. It's just to show you that the solution that we have is, again, it's an appliance form factor. If you start to use software or virtualization, because obviously decryption is computationally expensive, it's very hard to do software-based decryption. So obviously we have a dedicated hardware appliance to do that. And you can see the various abilities in terms of packet processing and how much SSL traffic it can deal with, and maybe some a bit of nighttime reading. But what I wanted to really show you here is the list pricing. It's something we wouldn't typically do, but when you try and do SSL inspection on a firewall and you get that 80% performance drop, to give you an example, that's like buying a 1 gig firewall, turning on an SSL inspection, and now it can only do 200 megabits per second. Well, the vendor loves it because then you've got to buy 5 firewalls to get back to the throughput you had originally scoped for. But that's very, very expensive. And the reason why I wanted to show the list pricing of this in dollars is just to show that this is a vendor-neutral, comprehensive approach of removing that blind spot and improving all your existing investments and basically getting a bigger return for the investments you've already made. So it's a very cost-effective approach of mitigating the risk. Okay, so in summary, it's an automated process. We don't downgrade the cipher suites that have been established. Again, because we support over 70 of those cipher suites, we're not going to do, some vendors spin it as cipher agility. Basically it means they don't understand the cipher that's been agreed and negotiated with the end user and the server. And because we can't understand that, we're going to essentially certificate resign or actually terminate and then downgrade to a cipher suite we do support, which is typically weaker. So that's a really big concern. I'll talk about getting a return on existing investments. So imagine again you've made an investment of $100,000 on a sandbox and it can only see 50%. You could argue that you're only getting $50,000 worth of return, but by removing that blind spot for a minimal cost, you can ensure that investment sees 100% of that traffic, so maximize that investment. And obviously the policy-based decryption helps the compliance concerns. Just wanted to give you one example. This is certainly one of my biggest use cases. I was engaged with this bank for about 18 months, but if anyone on the call today would like a one-to-one with obviously myself and Open Reality, I've got so many use cases over 3 years, and different things that drove them to do deployments like this, but happy to talk about these in detail at a later date. I've removed the logos for obvious reasons. But this is a really good bank where they made a massive global investment actually in Trend Micro from a sandboxing perspective. And they looked at FireEye, Cisco, and Blue Coat as well. They looked at all these solutions, and they decided ultimately to go with the Trend Micro solution. But what's really interesting here is at the very beginning, I was part of this meeting. It was an RFP meeting. We had about 30 people in the room, and there were probably the same amount that WebEx did over teleconferencing. And the first thing we did was, you're buying it. You're going to invest in the sandbox solution. You've not mentioned SSL in anywhere throughout your RFP. And so rather than actually go through our RFP answers for that 2-hour slot for the RFP review to get down selected, we simply said, there's just no point having this conversation unless you solve this SSL issue. And we just kept hammering it home for that meeting. And as you can see here, they did take that on board. It wasn't budgeted for, and they obviously put the SSL decryption capability in. And then ultimately what they've done is, and this is still actually ongoing now, they're deploying our solution across 47 sites worldwide, and that solution is feeding their Trend Micro investment to find malware that's obviously zero-day malware essentially that's bypassing their controls. And I think what's interesting here is this is a great quote from one of the architects, and really kind of shows that, kind of validates the concerns that we expressed at the beginning. And it's brilliant because they're basically saying, actually the more detailed quote, but basically what they're saying is it didn't matter whether we went to FireEye, Cisco, Blue Coat, Trend, it didn't matter. The detection rate between those capabilities, it could be plus or minus 5% or 10% maybe. It's relatively small gains, you could argue, okay? But without the SSL piece, they couldn't see half the traffic, irrelevant of the investment. So they're saying, choose the right sandbox, you might get, say, a 2 or 3% better, or maybe 5% better detection rate by choosing the right sandbox for your requirements. But putting in SSL visibility improved it by 50%, which is obviously a much more significant gain. So this is why I like to reference this. But again, if anyone wants to talk about this one offline, they're actually referenceable on an ad hoc basis. So if you would like more information, happy to arrange that. Another one I've worked with as well personally, with a pharmaceutical. Essentially, I had spoke to the network and security architects for must be nearly 2 years actually, and the security and network teams knew the need for this. They've got forensics, they've got sandboxing, they've got DLP, but they couldn't see 70% of the traffic. I think it was over 70-75% of the traffic was encrypted. So they were shouting internally to the US saying that we can't see anything, we can't do our jobs, and nothing happened. And let's just say that there was a number of employees that from the UK that stole millions of dollars of research on cancer and then ran off to China to set up a company to then sell that. And actually what's interesting is the security architect ended up phoning me saying, I've now got their attention. And this is being deployed as we speak as well, across 8 sites. But again, they've made significant investments in various defense and depth tools, and they could only see 30% of the network, and that's now a risk that it's unfortunate they had to lose millions of dollars of data to finally get the sponsorship they required internally, but I guess that's the world we live in. So always good to try and be proactive, but appreciate sometimes you need that pain to get the attention needed internally. Oh, actually, on that point as well, when I talk about objections, it was in this example that I'm referring to where legal jumped in at just as they're about to push the button to purchase a solution, deploy. That's when legal stepped in. And I suppose the key message here is engage them early. Don't leave it like these guys did. They were in a bit of a panic, obviously, but don't leave it to the last minute and then legal find out they don't want to sign it off, and it just delays your project success. So the thing I've learned is recommend engage them at the very early stage when you think I want to try and do something about this blind spot. And I think that's obviously just a DLP deployment for a large bank, but I think hopefully the message with the 2 previous use cases suffices. Okay, so that really concludes this presentation. Actually, I suppose in terms of call to action, we appreciate that this is kind of an awareness opportunity. So hopefully, something has made you raise your eyebrows, and if you could educate your peers and just highlight that risk, and think about that SSL malware, that spike that we showed at one of the first slides. How quick that risk exposure is increasing. Go away and determine what are you currently doing around SSL? Are you doing it on that firewall? Are you doing it on that application delivery controller? And then obviously, and then I suppose can you improve upon that based on the various deployment strategies we've discussed today? So I'm just going to hand it back over. I don't know if Craig's on, but I'm going to hand it back to Sam, I believe, and maybe to some Q&A. So thank you for your time.
Yes, thanks, James. Fantastic presentation. I've got a couple of questions here. So one is, do you support public key algorithms such as DHE, ECDHE that use perfect forward secrecy?
Okay, yes. So in terms of public key, yes, we do support RSA like many do, but we do also support the Diffie-Hellman exchange, but also the the ECDHE version as well. So as you guys know, I'm sure for those that don't, if you think about perfect forward secrecy, the whole concept is you have some encryption communication, but if someone compromised the server that holds the private key, you could then retrospectively go back and decrypt everything that was sent, if you assuming you recorded that traffic. So obviously the way to counter that kind of post-breach replay is essentially using something like Diffie-Hellman or the EC version of Diffie-Hellman. I suppose the short answer is yes, we do support PFS. So yes, we do support that, and also the symmetrical keys. So when we think of like char, Camellia, AES, for example, we have a very comprehensive capability.
Great. There's another question here about sort of legal and compliance teams, which I think you've kind of addressed already about, have they blocked it in past due to privacy concerns?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in every meeting we have, this, it always comes up. What about privacy? And some people even bring that up as an objection without really understanding the laws behind it. And I'm certainly no lawyer, but what I would say is that organisations that have a true desire to mitigate this risk, whether it's in Germany, Switzerland, France, obviously some of the strongest works councils and compliance mandates. We've managed. I can't think of any country that we've been able to where a project has actually been halted because of the privacy argument. It's always about getting balance. So yeah, engage them early.
Right. And then the final question here, saying, I'm pretty sure that VSS and RSA have a similar visibility appliance.
Yeah. So right. So what's interesting is we have the only dedicated SSL appliance on the market today. What's interesting is when Blue Coat acquired Netronome, which is the underlying hardware that we purchased over 3 years ago, when Blue Coat acquired Netronome, they're a chip manufacturer. Again, this goes back to this point where they just built a chip to prove how good their chips were, so they focused on decrypting traffic, and Blue Coat acquired that. But when we acquired Netronome, they had an OEM strategy, so they never sold these appliances directly and branded it as Netronome. They OEM'd it. So the likes of Cisco, SourceFire, RSA, Fidelis, VSS, the tapping company, for example, they all actually, it's a rebrand, it's a new label of the appliance that's owned by Symantec. Now over the period of 3 years, we've actually terminated those OEMs to have a direct model. So now the likes of Fidelis and VSS, for example, RSA, Cisco, when, for example, you might buy an RSA or Cisco appliance, like an ASA, for example, they will typically then say, well, for SSL inspection, go and speak to Blue Coat. That's who we used to use anyway. So we kind of have more of a kind of a referral model now, rather than allowing them to rebrand it as their own. So yeah, there's only one dedicated appliance out there, which is ours. And if you've heard of RSA, Cisco, VSS, Fidelis, it's actually Symantec appliances rebranded.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you very much, James. Thank you, everybody. If you have got any further questions, then please do get in touch with us. Our contact details are on screen, and so are James's if you've got any more questions for him. We'll be making the recording and the slides available probably tomorrow, so look out for an email about that. Right, thank you, everybody.
That's great. Thank you.